Hello and welcome to this video. So who is Gerald? He's around 30 years old, placing him in between the oldest and the youngest characters in the play. He is the son of the Croft family and is engaged to Sheila Burling, really as a marriage of convenience, but cheats on her with Daisy Renton. He represents Priestley's criticism of the hypocrisy of sexist and misogynistic views, and in the end chooses capitalism over empathy. Hi everyone, hope everybody's got their highlighter, their pencil and an Inspector Calls book. Let's get into it and go to page 161 to get started. You should be very familiar with this page by now. These are your opening stage directions, and this opening here, I've done it in a clean copy just so you can see my annotations really clearly. I've started off and I've picked out this description of Gerald Croft, who the video is about today. He's an attractive chap, about 30, rather too manly to be a dandy, but very much the easy, well-bred young man about town. So, Priestley gives us this, the director, this description of what Gerald should look like. He is, firstly, well, he's an attractive chap. Lucky him. It means that he doesn't have to worry about much, and certainly links to this image, this theme of being superficial and, judging people based on how they look, which is ultimately why Eva loses her job in the first place from Millwoods, but also tells us that Gerald doesn't need to try. And he doesn't need to try because he is attractive. It's just he's too manly to be a dandy. It means that he doesn't need to bother with trying to be good looking because he is. He is stylish and he is easy. He's also well bred. Got here. And this tells us that he is, upper middle class. Middle class. He is the son of the Crofts, and that means that he is wealthy. This is a stereotype that Priestley was hoping to play on. These rich boys that came out of these families often weren't particularly nice people, and that was worrying for him because they were the future generation. He's 30 years old, which tells us that he's not old or young. He's somewhere in between. But this is he's a quite cool, calm, collected character who doesn't need to worry too much about the world around him because he is good looking, he is rich. It's not him that suffers in the reality of things. It is people like Eva Smith. My next quote is on page 173. And is Gerald's response, I think, is significant to Burling and why he sacked Eva Smith. He says, "You couldn't have done anything else." Well, firstly and most importantly, it tells us that he shares Burling's capitalist views. And at the beginning of the play, he is more on the side of Burling and Mrs. Burling than he is on the side of the inspector and eventually Sheila and Eric. He says, "You couldn't have done anything else apart from let her go." I think there are a lot of things that he could have done, but Gerald agrees with Burling. I mean, there's an argument that he is the marrying Burling's daughter, so he's got to kind of suck up to her a little bit. But he uses this modal verb here to say that, you couldn't have done anything else. There weren't any other options for you. And ironically, of course, there were. And I think it's quite a short, declarative sentence. Bad handwriting going on here. That's an R-A. Declarative sentence outlining his stance and his opinion. I've just written here, it shows the audience his stance and backs up Priestley's argument of, not everybody is savable in this reality. The next quote is on page 177 that I've picked, and I think this is a kind of creepy, if they weren't engaged it would be creepy, reaction to why Sheila was at Millwoods. Sheila was at Millwoods, which is a clothes shop. We know that she was there, and as a result Eva got fired, and Sheila says, "Should we go there? In fact, I was there this afternoon, archly to Gerald," quite flirtatious here, "for your benefit." And Gerald is like, "Good." I think it kind of puts him across as a bit of a smarmy character, but also reminds us that at the beginning of the play, Sheila and Gerald are actually very flirtatious, and they joke and flirt with each other, and their relationship's fairly serious because Gerald gets out a ring and, you know, gives it to Sheila. They're getting engaged. It is a serious relationship, and kind of makes Gerald's announcement that he had an affair with another woman all the more shocking. But this quote here links to your benefit, to the misogyny that was about at the time. The fact that Sheila felt that she had to dress in a certain way to please this man links in with that idea of looking a certain way, and it was going back to Gerald being an attractive chap. That's important, and that superficiality ultimately led to Eva losing her job and ending up in the position that she did, and eventually committing suicide. But I think it's quite an interesting quote when you look at what we learn about Gerald a bit later on. Also, Gerald tries to be defensive, doesn't he? He tries to be defensive of Sheila, and at the beginning of Act 2, and this is page 183, beginnings of these acts don't have numbers on, do they? He wants to protect Sheila, or does he? Well, firstly, he wants to protect Sheila from things that are unpleasant and disturbing. This is kind of like chivalrous Edwardian viewpoint that men were protectors of women, and women only liked clothes and pretty things, and were incapable of having independent viewpoints. And in 1912, women were seen as social inferiors. I was going to put 1910 there. Social inferiors to men, and they weren't taken seriously. It wasn't until 1945, which is the same year as the release of this play, where, well, it was around that time that women were given much more equality following the women's rights. And we've already talked in previous lessons and videos that Priestley was an advocate for women's rights. And the inspector says, and you think women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things? I think these adjectives that he kind of repeats here, and the inspector does that a lot throughout the play, kind of repeats what the viewpoints that he doesn't agree with, almost to reaffirm how wrong they are. He talks here about these sexist and patronising, dodgy handwriting views of, you know, protecting women from these unpleasant and disturbing things. It links to these male values of protecting women. And, I mean, Gerald isn't being outwardly sexist, he's just conforming to what was expected of him in Edwardian kind of gentry, upper-class behaviour, you know. But I think looking back at it, you know, from 1945 or even from 2020, as we are, certainly makes him sound a little patronising. Particularly as he doesn't just want to protect her from, you know, the truth and the terrible things to do with Eva. There's also his infidelity. My next quote is on page 189. There it is. 189, and this is the admission of guilt. This is Gerald talking about what happened that night that he went out. He went to a bar, firstly, which is a favourite haunt of women of the town. I think quite a damning description from Sheila, who doesn't use the euphemisms of, you know, but kind of repeats what he says. What he says up here, he says, is a favourite haunt of women of the town, and it's when Mrs. Burling is unsure of what he's talking about. He says, that's ultimately to do with prostitution, and kind of puts him across as a bit of a degenerate. And at this point, he's not a particularly pleasant character, and I think our opinion of him falls dramatically. He's kind of like wobbles in between likeable and unlikable, because he's just there kind of as to bounce off Burling, really. But at this point, you know, this is his admission of terrible guilt, and you've got this use of the word haunt of women. And a haunt means a hangout, but I think it's an interesting word to look at in terms of duality and metaphorical sense, in it being kind of quite foreshadowing and linking to death. Down here he says, Gerald says, I hate these hard-eyed, dough-faced women. He's talking about poor, ugly women. He does not like a woman because he looks at her and deems her to be ugly. Then I haven't got time for you. I don't like you. I don't want to look at you. You're hard-eyed. Why are you hard? Why are women hard-eyed in that time period? Certainly wouldn't see Sheila in a place like this. Perhaps hard-eyed because maybe hard-eyed due to experience. And this dough-faced women maybe describes them as not looking particularly good-looking or pretty, and are shapen, their faces perhaps shapen by the wares of the world. And Gerald described his first sighting of Daisy Renton, as he grew to know her as young and fresh and charming, and that's everything that he wants in a woman. In the way that she looks, and she's young and she's fresh, is quite horrible considering what happens to her, and charming. And these adjectives describe Daisy Renton, as she's known as there, describes him as particularly vain at this point, and demonstrates this 1912 view of women, that women needed to be good looking, and shows how superficial these young boys were. Okay, following on from that, we think, can't fall any lower, and actually kind of starts to make a bit of a comeback. We feel a little bit for Gerald because he's been so open and honest. He's also almost like quite openly apologetic, and you've got this page, which is 193, where he talks with lots of hesitation, lots of pauses, and these short kind of sentences divided up by these dashes. And just if you look at this page, how many there are on the page shows perhaps indecision. And that's what I've written down here. These dashes show indecision. Listen to this line. He said, in that case, as I'm rather more upset by this business than I probably appear to be, and, well, I'd like to go to be alone for a little while. I'd be glad if you'd let me go. Listen to how, well, firstly, the dashes indicate pauses and show that he's indecisive. He's unsure how to feel at this point. But also how they frame this word upset. It describes us that Gerald is used to behaving in a certain way. He's from a certain background, and the fact that he is unsure how to describe his feelings and to actually talk about how he's feeling than he appears to be, he is unused to feeling this way. This is not usual for him. And it tells us at this point, you know what, there is hope for Gerald. There's a chance that he might be savable. He might be one of those that realise, do you know what, we can't treat women in this way, especially women of a lower class. But the final page of the play tells us that, unfortunately, Gerald, nah, mate, you're no change there. And at the end, when they realise the inspector is potentially not real and this didn't happen, his last line in the play is, well, everything's all right now, Sheila. And he holds up the ring. What about this ring? And kind of, Sheila talks about, she says, no, not yet, it's too soon, I must think. And he kind of gives him some suggestion that he might be able to kind of rekindle their marriage, and even even Berling's willing to forgive him because this is a man who comes from a wealthy family and they're getting married, which will benefit Berling. This ring as well is a constant theme in the play, and it's that idea of possession, that link to subjectifying women to being possessions in 1912. Ultimately, it shows us that he hasn't changed, and this man who's halfway between being old and being young, he is a character who doesn't quite make it, and is a warning to those younger generations that that they are at risk of being a Gerald, of understanding why things are sad, but not actually making any changes in their attitudes and day-to-day behaviour. Okay, that's it for today. That's my top quotes for Gerald. Hope you've enjoyed it. See you next time.